Welcome to another exciting edition of Break Fake Rules. We have one of the most famous, I think, rule breakers with us today, someone that many of you who watch this podcast regularly and listen to it, I'm sure are familiar with, and that is Farhad Ebrahimi. And thank you, Farhad, so much for coming on the program today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a great honor.
Yeah, we have been following your work a long time. We at Stupski are a spend down, and naturally, when you start out, you scan about and see who is out there spending down, and your name came up in almost every conversation. And as if I have it right, you're in the midst of a second spend down right now. Do I have that right, or just the first one is over and you're on to other things?
So the first spend down has what we might consider like a long tail of exit grants. So the Chorus Foundation is gone. But Chorus grantees will still be receiving resources coming from an additional pool of money that became liquid until 2033. So 10-year spend down and then 10 more years of exit grants.
And is that something that the grantees knew about, or was that a surprise toward the end that you made them aware of?
It was a little bit of a surprise to all of us. So for folks who don't know the Chorus backstory, I founded it in 2006 with the goal of redistributing all the wealth that was under my direct control at the time. It ended up being about 65 million over that period of time from 2006 to 2023. We always knew it would sunset, but the spend down clock started in 2013. So, starting in 2013, our grantees knew we would be spending down. Our anchor grantees had 10-year general operating commitments. Many of our other grantees were engaged in participatory grant making processes. And as we came to the latter half of that 10-year spend down, additional resources had started to become liquid in my family and were going to start coming to me. And so I worked with the folks at a family office to figure out what the distribution schedule could be for that. And then we were able to organize that into 10 more years of grants for all the Chorus grantees after Chorus left, generally at the same or higher levels than they received from the foundation.
That's really interesting. You said a number of things I'd love to follow up on. However, our time is short, and I don't want to keep us just in the spend down world. I think people who know me, know the show, know that I would talk about this all day. But I do want to get back to you at some point to talk about what you've learned since that experience with spending down. But I want to move on now to another concept that you are affiliated with, which is this idea of abolishing philanthropy, or being a philanthropic abolitionist. Listeners to this show will be familiar with this concept because on our second podcast, much to my surprise, I was speaking with one of the employees of Stupski, Jen Wynn, who told me that she is a philanthropic abolitionist, which I thought was really telling about Jen, a very courageous person who will look at her boss who runs the foundation and say, I think this whole thing needs to end. Which, I'm not so far away from her on that. What does that mean to you, philanthropic abolitionist?
Well, I think it comes from the fundamental analysis that in a truly just and equitable society, we would not have resources extracted and consolidated and put in the control of a small number of people, whether it's a small number of wealthy people or a small professional class in philanthropy. That, private philanthropy in particular is a symptom of a deeply inequitable society.
Yes.
And so the goal then is to get to a society that neither needs nor is capable of producing private philanthropy as we understand it currently. Now, obviously, philanthropy has its roots, the word itself, right, in the love of fellow people. It could mean a lot of things, but what it means in terms of the institutional private version, what it means in terms of high net wealth major donors, that's something that I have clarity on, that like the world that I want to be part of building doesn't produce those kinds of outcomes anymore. The challenge, and I think this is a challenge with any form of abolition, is that I don't think there's like a switch that we can find in the forest under some leaves that just says, make this sector go away, right? And make the conditions that have produced this sector go away. It's about navigating contradictions. And, I think of it as an abolitionist frame. I also think of it as a just transition frame. Big fan of the folks from movement generation. And I think one of the things that they always say about just transition is it's a process of navigating contradictions. One of those contradictions is that, the Course Foundation, in and of itself, right? Something I did for 17 years that I'm very proud of. That's like the reason I get asked to be on podcasts like this is in and of itself, I would say it's a false solution. That's not actually what we want. Now, is it the right organizing opportunity in this moment? I mean, clearly I believe so, right? I spent 17 years of my life working on it. I'm engaged in supporting other folks to do similar things, but having that ability to say, I mean, it's really like a master's tools, master's house thing. And don't get me wrong, like that quote is scripture, but even scripture can be used as a bludgeon. And I think there are just so many ways that folks can take transformative approaches to philanthropy, institutionally, individually. But what's important to me is that the North Star be trying, even if it's by baby steps, to credibly move closer to a world in which communities would no longer need private philanthropy or philanthropy writ large to support them, and where the resources would not be extracted and consolidated in a way that would leave rich people and corporations saying, geez, what do we do with this extra money that we don't need for ourselves?
And it's gotten to a very extreme place, and I think it will only get more extreme. I was doing some research recently. 3,000 people have control over something like 80 to 90% of the resources, financial resources in our world. That does not make for a democracy. Does not make for the conditions of a democracy. What other, and then we'll move on to another topic, but what other fake rules are you looking at, or have you had to push up against with respect to abolishing philanthropy?
Well, and I told you before we started, I put together a list because I felt like it was a good exercise for me to remind myself of all the things. And I didn't do this alone, right? Like these are things that I did or that Chorus did, but also just like want to give flowers to Resource Generation, Solidaire, Justice Funders, Neighborhood Funders Group, and then also a bunch of Chorus grantees, Climate Justice Alliance, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, Movement Generation, and Center for Story-Based Strategy. Like these are all the folks I was in community with in trying to figure these things out. But I mean, it feels like the first rule that I personally broke is if you're gifted millions of dollars, then you shouldn't give it all away, right? That comes from this assumption that safety and security comes from what's in your bank account rather than the web of relationships that you have. Both my parents are refugees. My dad's Iranian. My mom was born in Cuba. There's some trauma there, right? In my family, there's some assumptions about what makes us safe and secure. And for me, that's just never been like, oh, if something awful happens to me, I hope I have enough money in the bank to deal with it. It's also like, oh, if something awful happens to me, I've got friends. They'll help me out the way that I'd help them out. And that's it's just a different way of thinking of that question. Want to give a lot of credit, by the way, to Iris Brilliant, who's somebody I know through Resource Generation, who's written on this topic, I think, really, really eloquently. I think some other rules, just in terms of philanthropic culture, some of these things have shifted, by the way, in the last 20 years, but like, don't talk about power, don't talk about failure, don't communicate directly, don't be ideological. Some of these rules, by the way, are things that conservative funders are better at, right? They're unabashedly ideological. They make long-term commitments to people or ideas just because they believe in them, and they don't hold a yardstick up to them every year to see if they're performing. I think, some other rules or assumptions, this idea that being a good funder is about being the smartest person in the room with respect to the topic, to the issue area. And I just feel like something that I learned time and time again is that if we're going to go with like a gardening set of metaphors, like funders are not the landscaper or the gardeners. At best, we're the microbes in the soil, right? Like we make it possible for things to grow. When we start saying this should grow over here and this should only get that big and that we don't want at all, I don't think we actually support a powerful change ecosystem. I think related to that are these ideas of measuring and evaluating grantees, that like funders are the ones that should be doing the measurement and evaluation, as if grantees didn't want to learn from and understand their own work. Like
Right.
maybe we should be fluent in how they do that instead of
Right.
requiring them to be fluent in how we do it. I think also that this idea that community organizations can't make informed, accountable, and strategic decisions about resource allocation. Like, oh, we trust them to do their organizing, but we're never going to let them into the decision making around resource allocation. And I think that's an assumed rule, or that is a huge problem. And then finally, there's like the greatest hits with the spend down ones, right? This idea that spending down means leaving your grantees high and dry, or that you're no longer relevant or influential. This idea, and I want to, if you're interested, I'd love to talk about this one more. This idea that continuing to be a grant maker next year is more important than your grantees surviving this year.
Oh, this is a big one. Big one for me.
Huge. Well, because it comes down to that assumption that like we will always need philanthropy, right?
Yeah.
And so to do something that says, actually, I don't need to continue to be a funder, my institution doesn't need to continue to exist, I don't think people will always need institutions like mine. Like, that is something that not just in philanthropy, I think there's a lot of movement folks who struggle with that as well, because we are all so acclimated to the idea that even when we're like unapologetically anti-capitalist and critical of philanthropy in the nonprofit sector, there's still this like, if you talk about Chorus or Stupsky spending down, there's still some people who are like, oh, I can't celebrate that. That sounds like a funeral.
Yeah.
And it is a set of assumptions, a set of rules that results in a failure to imagine what could be different if we are less institutionalists, right? And thinking more in like a transformational, relational, movement-oriented way.
Thank you for tuning in to Break Fake Rules. Subscribe to the Stupsky Foundation YouTube channel to watch videos of each episode, and join the conversation with me on LinkedIn.